Hi, Year 12. So this is your psychology lesson for Tuesday, which will be the 12th of May, just trying to help you keep track there. And this is our lesson on phobias and how we treat phobias. So remember, we're looking from the behavioural perspective. So we're going to be thinking about one of a few different behavioural treatments for phobias. So we'll do one this lesson, and then we'll look at another one on Wednesday's lesson as well. So for your retrieval, just a few names really that we've come across in this psychopathology topic so far. So all quite recent, but you might have to rack your brains for some of them. So we've got Watson, Jehoda, Dr. Satz, and Maurer. And all I want you to do is have a go at essentially filling in this grid or jotting it down in some way where you're identifying basically what they did or what they said, and then how that links to this topic of psychopathology. All right, so pause the video and have a go at doing that retrieval task and really give as much detail as you can about each of those names. If you can't do it, you leave it blank, be honest with yourself, and then you know where the gaps are. So hopefully you had a go at that. We'll just quickly review the answers. So we should know, and we should be confident from the last couple of lessons, that Watson was one of the psychologists who was involved with that case study of little Albert, which allows us to see that you can actually learn a phobia through association. So that principle of classical conditioning again. And we know that that is the basis of phobias that we look from, that perspective that we say that all behavior is learned, and that includes phobias. So we're looking from our behavioral point of view. Jehoda was the one who we should associate with those criteria of ideal mental health. So that comes under that definitions, how we define abnormality. Dr. Satz, probably that was the one you struggled with, I would imagine. That was at the very beginning of this psychopathology topic, and I showed you a little video clip of him. He's somebody who we could argue was sort of a little bit anti-psychiatry, even though he was a psychiatrist. But the bit that he was anti was against using these labels in diagnosing certain disorders. So the example he talked about at length was ADHD. Actually, that's just a person's character. That's just an aspect of their behavior. And when we decide to put a label on it, really what we're trying to do is control. So that links into your definitions of abnormality. And last one, and this is the most recent, Maurer, that two-process model, explains how phobias form in the first place through the classical conditioning, and then how they're maintained through that idea of operant conditioning and avoidance, avoiding being exposed to it, and the negative reinforcement that that brings. So again, if you've got big gaps there, pause this, jot down where your gaps are, go away, spend some time reading back through, maybe going back and watching a couple of the previous videos. If you think there's a lack of understanding and you've kind of missed it, if you think, oh yeah, I did know that, but I've just forgotten it, well, it just shows you need to retrieve it more often. You just need to keep revisiting those flashcards. All right, but you've got that sort of luxury, if you like, of being able to pause me and go back and recap, which you don't have in the lesson in live time normally. Okay, so if we're confident with that, we can move on. So as I said, this lesson, we're focusing on how we treat phobias. So, or one of the ways anyway. So we're looking at this part here of our knowledge organizer, and we're thinking about this method here, systematic desensitization. That's the one we're going to focus on today. Probably the one you will think of when I say how do we treat phobias is flooding. That's the one that the media will have presented on these TV shows because that's the most dramatic, exciting one. And we'll come on to that next lesson. But actually what's used far more commonly is the strategy of systematic desensitization. And we'll have a think about what those words might mean. But before we do that, because this is going to be really important that this is fresh in our mind, that case study of little Albert that I keep mentioning, what I'd like you to do is just read through those, imagine they were cards, and place them in the right order. Now, obviously, because you haven't got it cut up into cards, and I don't want you to waste your time doing so, just literally number them 1 to 9. In the case of little Albert, which was essentially an experiment because they were manipulating a variable, what came first? Place them in order 1 to 9. Okay, so pause me and have a go at that. Hopefully you've had a go at that, and this is what we should have ended up with. So the first step was that we needed to choose our sample, we needed to choose our participant, and we chose little Albert, as he's known, because he was assessed and he was emotionally stable. We didn't want to choose an infant who had a real who was emotionally unstable, because then we wouldn't have been able to draw any conclusions. The second step, or the second observation really, is we saw that he was actually totally unafraid of most things that we presented to him. So he was unafraid of a range of objects, including a white rat. He was very interested in the white rat, a rabbit, wooden blocks, lots of different things presented, no fear shown, no anxiety. He was afraid of the loud noise, so that was number 3, which is what we would expect because all infants are. We think, remember, back to the evolutionary explanation, that might actually just be a protection mechanism because loud noises often do represent danger. Number 4 then, he was shown that rat again, that remember he'd shown particular interest and really a liking for, but this time when he reached for it, a loud noise was made. So we're starting to expect little Albert to form that association between the thing he isn't afraid of and the thing that he is, the loud noise. Number 5, a week later, it was repeated 5 times. Remember, to classically condition somebody, it has to be repeated. Pavlov did it with the dogs. If you were trying to classically condition somebody, which we have jokingly said about in class before, haven't we? It is possible, but you have to do it consistently and you have to repeat it a number of times. So repeated number of times a week later. Albert appeared to be afraid of the white rat at this point. So what's happened? We now know the classical conditioning's happened. The association's been made. Took a little while, number of times, but at this point, when we see that he is now afraid of the white rat, we know that conditioning has taken place. Albert had been classically conditioned, number 7. Albert was now afraid of white fluffy objects. Actually, 8 and 9 can go either way round. They're very much linked, because what we know little Albert did then is he generalised that fear from just the white rat to anything that had those similar characteristics. So he generalised his fear onto anything white and fluffy, e.g. Santa's beard. So that's the process. Remember, that was really important case study, really important experiment to show us that you can learn a phobia. You can be classically conditioned. Now, in that case, that was entirely manipulated by the researchers. But in real life, you learn your phobias, the behavioural approach tells us, because you've made an association between a negative experience and that neutral stimulus. That thing that happened to be there at the time when you had your negative experience. And that's when classical conditioning took place, and that's what's led you to have your phobia. Or at least that's what behaviourists tell us, and that's what Maurer and that's what Watson tell us. Okay, so make sure you're really confident on that case study. I know you've all done your little summary of it. That's important, but keep rehearsing it. Keep making sure you're really confident on it, because it's important when we start thinking about, okay, so if that's how we learn a phobia, how do we treat a phobia? It's not a case of unlearning, it's a case of relearning. So if it is true that we have learnt to be afraid of something because we've made an association between a negative experience and that phobic object, we need to get rid of that association. But this principle of systematic desensitisation, this treatment that we're going to look at, it doesn't try and unlearn what's already there. It just tries to replace that learning with some new learning, with something else. Okay, so this is the treatment we're really going to focus on today. Systematic, and you'll see how it is very systematic because it goes up in systematic steps. Desensitisation. Now, you might have heard that word before, somebody being desensitized to something. D at the front of a word usually gives it its opposite meaning. Yeah. So desensitized is when you are no longer sensitive to something. We talk about playing lots of video games, violent video games desensitizes children to violence. They no longer see it as shocking and upsetting because they're so used to it. Here, what we're doing is we're thinking about a systematic step-by-step approach so that when somebody is faced with, let's say it's birds, let's say their phobia is of birds, when they're faced with a bird, they're no longer bothered by it, desensitized. They're no longer sensitive to it. It doesn't create that anxiety attack that it did. And that's the treatment that we're going to focus on today. And it's behavioral because it uses the principles of classical conditioning and getting somebody to form a new association that overrides that negative association that they've already got going on in there. And it does so by using an anxiety hierarchy. So on the slide, you can see there, I'm just breaking down really some of the key terms that we need to be confident on for this particular treatment. So if you think about it, a hierarchy is steps, isn't it? It's getting higher and higher up. An anxiety hierarchy is exactly that. You identify for your phobia at the bottom, the thing that, yeah, it does cause you anxiety, but the lowest level, and build up and up and up to your worst case scenario, the worst thing you could possibly imagine having to do or be exposed to for your phobia. And what would happen in systematic desensitization is you and your therapist, this has to be done by trained professionals, anybody can't just do it as they go along. You would sit and you would identify the steps in your anxiety hierarchy. You'll see one in a minute. I'll give you a worked example. And that's the starting point for this systematic desensitization. I'll come back to some of those other key terms in a minute. So I've done one for the thing that I have a phobia of, and that is rats. Okay. And if I sat with a therapist and we identified what the steps in my anxiety hierarchy are, I would start off at the bottom and I'd say, well, just even seeing like a cartoon image, a still image, a pencil drawing of a rat, that causes me to feel a bit anxious because I'm like, don't like them. But it's not a massive high level of anxiety I feel at that stage. So we would identify that as stage one. Now, there's no particular number of steps you might have in your anxiety hierarchy. Everybody's different. You and your therapist would work towards the right one for you. And so then I think, okay, so what's worse than that? Well, what's worse than that is seeing a moving rat, a bit more real life, but still at a distance of on a film or on a computer screen. Then what if I'm exposed to it in real life, but I know it's completely contained and it's in a cage, maybe at the other side of a room? I can cope with that. Well, it's still going to cause me anxiety, but I'm not at the top yet. Then what if I'm closer? Then what if I'm in a situation where it's not contained, but it's not actually in physical closeness to me? I see one run past in a street or at a station or something. And then it gets worse. And you can see, and I'm not putting this on, I'm not joking. You can see now, I like taking a deep breath. Just for me, even imagining these top steps of my anxiety hierarchy actually does really genuinely make me feel quite anxious because this is a real phobia of mine. I wouldn't say it affects my daily, everyday life because thank goodness this isn't something we have to be exposed to very often. But that's what I would do. I would sit with my therapist and identify all of the steps in my anxiety hierarchy, going right up to the top. And the thing that I just can't even begin to imagine would be sort of, I've said on there, I'm a celebrity style, you know, when they put them in a box and had to be covered with them. And I can't watch that program, genuinely. I can't watch that program because you know there's always going to be rats on it and it freaks me out just seeing it on the TV. So that would be my anxiety hierarchy. So how's that going to help me? Well, it's all about the way I am relearning an association. So step one would be I've sat with my therapist and I've identified my anxiety hierarchy. Step two would be I'm now at each stage, and this is going to be very systematic, hence the name, and very gradual. I have to relax. It's actually impossible. I'm going to just jump back to those key words. And this bit at the bottom here, reciprocal inhibition. It's actually impossible to feel both anxiety and relaxation at the same time. It's impossible. So if somehow my therapist can allow me to be feeling relaxed whilst being exposed to that low level of my anxiety hierarchy, then I can't feel anxious. I can't feel both. Just the way our brain deals with feelings and emotions, sensations, I cannot feel both relaxation and anxiety. So how are they going to make me feel relaxed? Well, there's a number of things we can do. We can use kind of meditation techniques. We can use breathing exercises. We can use visualization techniques where we visualize being on a beach, lovely, calm, kind of take yourself away from the situation. Or we can use drugs. We can use anti-anxiety drugs, something like Valium. So they give me the drug so that I'm nice and relaxed and calm. Okay, so the relaxation bit is vital because that's the bit I'm making a new association here. I'm going to try and make a positive, relaxed association so that I can associate feeling comfortable and relaxed and calm with my phobic object, which happens to be rats. Okay, so that's the second step. I've got my hierarchy. I'm now being taught by a trained professional or being given drugs, some relaxation techniques. And then I'm exposed to it. So we've got my hierarchy. They've given me, let's say they've given me some drugs, they've given me some Valium, and then they present me with the bottom rung of my hierarchy. They present me with a picture of a rat. Okay? They'll usually ask me for a score, how anxious I'm feeling. They might be recording my heart rate, things like that, other measures that tell us how anxious we are. And when we're confident, and only when, and this is why it's a gradual process, but when we're confident that actually I've maintained quite calm and I am relaxed, we move up and then we do exactly the same again. And we move up and we move up. Now, this is likely to take several sessions. You're not likely to be able to progress all the way to the top of your hierarchy in one or even two treatment sessions because it's systematic, it's gradual, and it's about desensitizing me. Now, you'll see the word at the top here, counter conditioning. That just means remember, conditioning is learning through association. I am learning a new association that's going to counteract the negative one. So I'm learning this time to associate rats with a relaxing, calm feeling. Now, that's how it works. And it's done widely. This is used widely for all sorts of phobias. Of course, if the thing that you are phobic of is actually harmful, then the top part of your hierarchy, they're not going to put you in a harmful situation. So let's imagine let's imagine it's heights. The thing you might be most afraid of is falling out of a window without a device, without a parachute, without something to hold to. They're not going to expect you to do that. They're not going to throw you out of a window of a high-rise block of flats or something. It's always going to be safe and systematic and controlled. But it is about gradually getting you exposed to the thing that you're afraid of, but whilst being calm and relaxed. And that's the important bit. Okay. So I think if we were doing this in lesson, we'd have a bit of a chat and a discussion about what your phobias are, and we would have a think about your anxiety hierarchy. I think it's useful to do it because it just helps to concrete, to put in a concrete form this principle. So if you have a phobia, which many people do, even if it doesn't affect your everyday life, create an anxiety hierarchy. If you don't, do it for something like spiders. Yeah, just to practice the principles of how an anxiety hierarchy is actually created in the first place, and almost work through that. So I would suggest doing that because it just helps to make this a bit more concrete because it's quite abstract otherwise. Now, I'm always saying to you, aren't I, the devil is in the detail. And I'm usually talking about exam questions when I say that. And it's very much the case when looking at treatments. If you were to get an exam question about how systematic desensitization is used to treat phobias, they want the real detail. They want you to name the anti-anxiety drug that you might be given. Valium. It's not difficult to remember, but a lot of people will fail to give that level of detail. They want you to recognize that this isn't going to happen in one session, it's several sessions. They want you to use the key terminology, of course, like counter conditioning or reciprocal inhibition. Remember that you can't feel both anxiety and relaxed at the same time. It's partly how this treatment is effective and works. They want you to talk about the role that the therapist has in you creating your anxiety hierarchy. And of course, they want to see that you understand this is based on the principle of classical conditioning and forming an association. So this is almost a checklist, what I've presented with you on the screen there. It's almost a checklist of things, if you were talking about systematic desensitization, you would need to be aware of and you would need to include. So if I was you and I was thinking about rehearsing this, getting it into my long-term memory, making sure I've got flashcards to draw back upon and keep testing myself, I would almost create flashcards with those key terms on, and then I would have a flashcard which was almost a summary one, and it would be that checklist. And I would keep getting either testing myself or getting somebody else to test me on, have I remembered all of the things on my checklist that I need to talk about? And then, okay, I've remembered them all, but do I know what it means? Another flashcard, what is reciprocal inhibition? Yeah, I would really use that because it makes a big difference. And this is the sort of question I'm referring to. And this is only 4 marks, so actually you wouldn't need to include everything on that checklist, would you? And we should be able to immediately see, first word, I should be able to work out what type of question this is, what marks I'm going to be given. AO2, application. How do I know it? Because it's Mia. So immediately I've been given a person that I've got to apply my knowledge to. So we've got this usual type of exam question, STEM here. Mia has a phobia. There we are. I've zoomed in on that. I know I'm dealing with phobias here of eating in public. She's about to go to uni where she knows that she'll have to eat her meals in a large dining hall surrounded by other students. Describe how a therapist might use systematic desensitization to help Mia overcome her phobia. Now, my checklist comes in. I know I need to show the examiner that I understand that this treatment, systematic desensitization, is based on classical conditioning or counter conditioning. But I've got to make it relevant to Mia. So I want to talk about the anxiety hierarchy, but I'm actually going to give an example of what might be on the bottom rung of Mia's anxiety hierarchy and how she might have worked that through with her therapist. I want to give the detail about keeping her relaxed at each stage, so I might get her to do a meditation technique, a breathing exercise. I want to talk about that idea of her overcoming it because she's creating a new association. And she's gradually being exposed, she's systematically being exposed to having to eat in public. So they could give you some quite random phobias, as long as you can logically think it through and think, right, okay, so what would be the thing she's most afraid of and step it down, or least afraid of and step it up, then you're ready to approach that type of question. So you can have a go at that question. You've got the checklist there, but remember what I've recommended you do is memorize that checklist. So in a future lesson, and I'm not going to tell you when, I'll present you with a question like that, but without that scaffold of the checklist, and let's see how you do. All right, that's what we've got to work towards, obviously. Okay, last thing for today's lesson is just to give a bit of a wider context of quite an important study. So we know that all of this is sort of as a result of that early study in the 20s by Watson and Rayner, or Watson we generally refer to, the case of little Albert. Now, they were given a talk about the case of little Albert and talking about how it shows we can learn a phobia and we can condition somebody to have a phobia of something. And sat in the audience was somebody called Covert Jones, who's also another behavioural psychologist. Back then, a long time ago now, we're talking sort of 20s, 30s. And Covert Jones thought, okay, this is interesting. So you've classically conditioned someone to have a phobia. Can I use the same principle, classical conditioning, to cause infants that have phobias to overcome them? And the famous case that we look at for this is the case of little Peter. So Watson's case of little Albert shows we can learn phobias. Jones's case of little Peter shows that they can be unlearned. And little Peter had a fear of rabbits. And basically what Cova Jones, I should say, is she got him to form a new association. So that every time he was exposed to the thing he was afraid of, gradually, systematic, he was given something rewarding, something pleasant. It happened to be sweets or candy, as this article calls it. Now, that's different from how it's done today, isn't it? And I've posed that question at the bottom. In what way is that original study different to the systematic desensitisation we use today? We don't give sweets. We don't give reward at each stage of the hierarchy. We just ensure that you're relaxed. So it is different, but I think it's important that you have the context of the original study, because that is essentially, that was the starting point of systematic desensitisation as we know it today. So Jones and the case of little Peter is a case study, is a name to remember. Okay, so I'm going to leave that with you as sort of the ending point of the lesson, if you like. Have a read through that and have a think to yourself, in what ways is that original case similar to what we've just learned about systematic desensitisation, and in what ways is it different? Okay, so that brings this lesson to a conclusion. We haven't evaluated it, so just to give you the bigger picture, on Wednesday's lesson, we will look at another behavioural treatment, a far more extreme treatment for phobias, which is flooding. We'll do a tiny bit on something called token economy as well. So all behavioural treatments will then be covered. And then on Friday's lesson, we'll evaluate them all. How well do they work? Why would we use one and not the other? What are the problems, the implications and all that? So by the end of this week of learning, you will have finished phobias. We've defined it, talked about characteristics, we've explained it from the behavioural approach, and now we are treating it from the behavioural approach. All right, so hopefully that giving you the bigger picture, and so you can see what's coming up, will help you with your managing your time and organising your notes and so on. Okay, right, so Tuesday's lesson complete. Wednesday's lesson will be posted on the YouTube channel and resources shared ready for you as well. Okay then, thanks guys, bye.